standing room available.
Well, there was standing room available, but we had this intern at the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and he had seen everything that you've ever known. I mean, in that musicals, everything. And I said, well, and he was like 23 or 49. Well, how much he's paying for that in New York City? And I don't know how much the ticket was, but it was absolutely nothing.
You gotta
know the ins and outs.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Intern.
We want to welcome Al Schuler to our class. And I think the Clemmies have been here before. Welcome back. Okay, great. And I think everyone else has been here before as well, so welcome. Oh my. Well, there's a really interesting confluence today. One of our scripture readings in worship is one of our primary readings for today in class. I love it when that happens. And Dave has an important announcement.
Next Sunday is the Golden Corral Sunday. It's our quarterly
Brunch. The quarterly class brunch is next Sunday.
I thought he meant we were getting catered.
Surely we can do better than Golden Corral.
I know.
Yeah, next Sunday's brunch. Brunch.
Oh, snickeroos.
All right. Very good.
I'll put it in the email.
All right, so here's where we're headed today. We'll see how we do with this. My goal is to discuss the passages about heaven from Revelation. We've been working our way through the entire Bible on representative passages about heaven. And now we finally reached Revelation. Couple of things to say about this before we begin. Number one, please remember that the book of Revelation is an apocalyptic writing. It is not to be taken literally, despite what Tim LaHaye and Robert Jefferson had to do. Okay? It is visionary writing. It is metaphorical writing. It is to help us think in a new way about things. So it is not a literal description of anything. Okay? Just to start with, that will help us. Now, I mentioned the last several weeks, there is nowhere in the New Testament, in fact, there's no other book in the Bible that says as much about heaven as Revelation does. And with that, we need to remember, I know I'm a broken record on this, that when we look at the word that gets translated heaven in both Hebrew in the Old Testament and Greek in the New Testament, there's one primary word in Hebrew and one primary word in Greek. There are some others as well that serves a multitude of purposes that gets translated variously as heaven, firmament, skies, universe, all of these things. And so we have to be careful in understanding the difference between all of this. Now, what I did here for today's handout was I gave you just the back half of what we've been working on as a handout that just has several Revelation passages with it. And several, right? Just ignore that 2 Peter passage at the top of the page. We're done with that, all right? Beginning in Revelation chapter 2, verse 7, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Now, what does that mean? Well, you got to go back to Genesis, right? What was the problem with Adam and Eve? Right, and it was bad. And now it's good. Well, what's up with that, right? Has God changed the rules? I'm waiting on your answer.
No. Maybe just the circumstances.
Everything in its time, right? And I think the lesson from Genesis is everything God has created is good. You could make the case that Adam and Eve jumped the gun. right? It's not that what they ate was metaphorically was, what they did was in itself bad. It's the timing. It's not in God's time.
Is the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, are they the same thing?
Well, that is a wonderful question, Linda. Is the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil the same thing? So from the Genesis account, we have to think it's separate things, because God says, I must remove them lest they eat of the, right? And again, keep in mind, my reading of Genesis is probably not a literal tree either. This is descriptive of the concept. If you believe it's a literal tree, that's fine. I'm no beef with you on that. There's been a lot of speculation among people who want to find all the artifacts from the Bible about where the Garden of Eden was, believing it was a literal place. And now we've talked about Mormonism a lot. Mormons believe it was in Missouri, not far from where Jason Edwards Church is, in Liberty. There's a physical place, right, that they believe was the Garden of Eden, and that's where the second coming will happen, and all this.
Why would they think that?
That's the Book of Mormon. I mean,
Well, the Book of Mormon's funnier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The play.
oh yeah,
Anyhow,
that's hysterical.
yeah, okay. So that helps explain this passage that sort of is the introduction to the thought of heaven in Revelation. Then get on to chapter 4. Again, John the Apostle is describing in Revelation an apocalyptic vision that he had. Right? So this is, the whole setup for Revelation is that he's on the island of Patmos, and he's in the Spirit, and he sees this vision, right? After this, I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne, and he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. That is a lot to take in, right? And you want to say, if he's having a vision, how did he have time to count everything? I mean, I'm a person who likes to count things. I will walk into a room, I'll be sitting there like in a concert hall, and I'm the kind of person who will count the light fixtures. Right? Some of us are like that.
Yeah.
I can spend 10 minutes in any large room and tell you pretty close how many people it seats. Because I'm doing the math, right? How many rows, how many seats? So John must have been sort of like that. But it's also true that all of these numbers he uses are symbolic numbers. The 7s in particular, the 24 elders, and so forth.
But a lot of people take that as literally. I mean, a lot of religions are branches of religion.
Yeah, so a lot of American evangelical
Yes.
people take this literally. I need you to understand that the particular view that the Left Behind series goes about on this is not widely held in the world. It is widely held in a segment of American evangelicalism that is very loud. It is not the predominant view in Christianity. Yes, sir.
I heard a quote here a number of years ago. Revelation should be taken seriously, but not literally.
Yes, that is a beautiful way to say it. Revelation should be taken seriously, but not literally. So in this, we have this description that talks about a throne in heaven and one who's seated on the throne. And he had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. Now, do we take that as a literal statement that if Jesus is on the throne in heaven, or God is on the throne in heaven, that God is made of jasper and carnelian, whatever carnelian is? No.
It's a red stone. It's beautiful.
Is carnelian a red stone?
Yeah,
Okay.
red orange.
Very good.
Not red like.
Again, this is describing a magnificent scene of glory. I'm going to push through several of these and we'll keep discussing, but I want to pile several of them up for you. After this, chapter 7, verse 9, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one can number. He ran out of counting ability. From every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands. Well, so think about the symbolism here. If you're John, writing toward the end of the early church period, to say that there are palm branches has a very significant meaning to anyone who understands the story of Jesus, right? Now, it also has a cultural significance to it. Welcome. Hello there, our youngest member.
Applause.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry, because
Oh, you should make a grand entrance. Yeah, we're glad to see you too. Hello.
Congratulations.
hair is wet because I just got out of the shower, but we're here.
You're here, it's great. Awesome.
2 weeks old.
Wonderful.
Just tell her name one time.
Sailor.
I forgot, yeah.
Yeah, really, can we pass her around?
So there's a great multitude in heaven. What is interesting to note here, by the way, is that John says this multitude, this vision he sees, represents every nation, all tribes, and all peoples and languages. So even if you don't take this to be a literal description, you got to deal with the fact that all kinds of people are included in God's kingdom, right? We can talk about that for another hour.
Yes.
Chapter 11, verse 19. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the Ark of the Covenant. Wow, I thought Indiana Jones found it. Was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. Sounds like a weather report. Pete Delkus could have written this, right? The temple is opened, and the ark, and so there's this vision of supernatural events happening around this. So it's, I think the point we're to get from this is that this is extraordinary, right? Then chapter 12. Now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, I want you to take that passage, and we're baking a cake here. We're going to put that in a bowl over here to the side, because we're going to mix it in later. All right? I want to come back in a week or two and have a whole separate conversation on angels and demons. Angels and demons.
It makes it sound like hell is on earth.
So we're going to talk about that very idea of what are angels and demons and what do we do with them, right? So that's in our mixing bowl over here to the side, steeping a little bit.
Okay.
All right? Chapter 14. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Now, I've quoted this scripture more than a few times at the graveside, right? And it's comforting to us, but it comes out of a context that typically gets lost in this. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Well, why from now on? What about looking backward? Right? What about before now on? And they are blessed because they may rest from their labors, and their deeds follow them. Well, now,
That can be good or bad.
that's right. So for those of us who teach and preach a religion not of works, but of faith and belief, that's a little bit of a problem right here. I want you to hold on to that thought. I'm piling up the evidence here. Now to chapter 21. This is where it gets really thick. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Remember, the word heaven can be translated firmament, sky, of the above, right? So coming down from heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. For the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also, he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. So, one of the interesting possible interpretations of this passage from Revelation 21, if you think about the context of what the Bible calls a new heaven and a new earth, one of the interesting possible interpretations is that heaven comes down to earth
When? Now,
at the end of time.
okay.
That heaven comes and envelops earth. Now, I know sometimes we get the idea that everything's going to blow up,
Yeah.
right? There is one way of reading all of this, that everything's destroyed and recreated, right?
Right.
But another way of looking at this, and I'm not advocating for one over the other right now, another way of looking at this is that the heavens are opened and heaven comes down and envelops what we know as earth. That it's a blanket over it, that two realities merge in a way. A third way of thinking about this is that the veil that separates heaven from earth now is lifted apart, and we see, as Paul says elsewhere, more clearly what we've seen through the glass darkly. Yes, Carol Ann.
Two things. One, a song just struck my mind, a really old one. Heaven came down and glory filled.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Filled my soul.
You must have grown up in a Baptist church.
Yes.
Yeah.
When at the cross the
Yeah.
But
made me
also,
whole.
if everything explodes, then where are the saints?
In the air, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. Good question.
What was the
Yes.
question?
If everything explodes, where are the saints? Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so is this part of this particular scripture, the part that we're supposed to take literally, or take it as truth?
There is no part of Revelation I would take literally.
I really want to see to be in heaven.
This is Mark speaking. There are Christians who hold different views on this. I would not take a single word of Revelation literally.
Why was it written?
As a
Why are we
vision.
studying it?
And because it is a vision to help us. Well, this is a great question, Trish.
Yeah.
Because there are ancient church fathers in the early church and beyond who felt like Revelation shouldn't be in the Bible,
Right.
right? Because it is such an apocalyptic vision,
Right.
right?
Was this a vision given
To John.
to John on Patmos?
Patmos.
Okay, that's, okay.
Yeah. So, well, think about this. If this is a divinely inspired vision, there's value in it, right? There are concepts and principles that we can take from this type of vision, just like we can. This is not unlike most of the Old Testament prophets. If you go read the prophets, and they're doing all these crazy things, particularly Hosea. Right? I mean, they're just doing all these crazy things that are to illustrate what the message God is trying to give. Go to the potter's house and say to the potter this, and this the pot that's on a wheel represents you, and these messages that are it is not really much different than the way you might teach a children's Sunday school class, where you would bring in an object and you have a lesson about that object, and this is illustrative of some principle. That's really what Revelation can do.
Until we started this study, Mark, I didn't realize there is so much in the Bible that's where some of these offshoots of religion, not that I'm saying they're wrong,
Right.
but like you just said, there's all kinds of ways you can interpret things.
Oh,
And
yeah.
therefore, I mean, you can, I'm not, Mormonism or anything you want to name, there's certain pieces of where they get their elders and all this. And
Well, and you can see how some sects would read Revelation and sort of make alien invasion
Right.
as part of it. Right? Yes, Pam.
It kind of scares me, like, what if we interpret it wrong?
Amen.
What if you interpret
Really?
it? So here's my answer to that question.
Is there,
The risk is not yours.
Oh, dear.
Because I don't think you're required to have a proper interpretation of Revelation
To get in.
to be in God's kingdom. Because I think if it were required, it would be clearer,
Oh, okay, yeah.
right? If you boil everything down of what we know, there's one thing that matters, and the confession that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that God has created, right? How it all comes together, not ours to figure out.
Thank God.
People are naturally curious about it. And so we get back to this question of, okay then, why is this book in the Bible? When it's so darn confusing. I mean, didn't God know that we'd spin off a whole publishing industry of craziness?
Make lots of money.
And bad movies and everything? I mean, surely. Well, I think it's there in a way it was a message of hope to the early church, right? It can be a message of hope to us as well, but its original intention was to help the early church understand they would survive their persecution. And that the occupying forces that were against them would be overturned, right? So if you go back to what John's trying to say is, it's a message of endurance. It's pressing on, hold on, because God is going to make all things right eventually, even if you can't see it right now.
You know what, Mark, that's very comforting right now, too. It means we're gonna make it through this.
Well, that's right. So
Life
it
itself.
is an eternal message, right? And it's not too different from Psalm 27, which we're studying in worship for 4 weeks. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Of whom shall I be afraid? That preach, right?
When
Yeah.
you were gone, Jim taught on hope.
Yes.
And this is something, gives you hope.
So hope is a recurring message
Right.
of the New Testament, because remember the early church, the early Christians, they were truly persecuted, right? And they didn't see the hope that we see today with the church and the message of Christ having survived and thrived in the way that it has. We can't get ourselves quite in their position with this. Now, yes. Jim and Hart.
Go ahead. You've got your hope, and then you've also got your retribution on those who are evil.
Oh, retribution.
That you want,
Yeah. Well, we all want retribution, don't we?
Yeah.
And this is one of the grand questions as we dangle between heaven and hell in our conversation is, will there be retribution? Right? The only thing I can point to that I don't like is the teaching that says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Man, I want to execute vengeance, right? Yeah, Hart.
at the time that this was written, what was the idea of heaven prior to the time that this was written?
Okay, so Hart has asked, what was the idea of heaven prior to the time this was written? I'm so glad you asked that, because one of the recurring questions that we've had is, what did Jews believe about heaven, and what do Jews believe about heaven today? And I've actually done some more reading on that in the past week, and have learned that sort of what we said at one point is true. Historically, in the ancient past, and even into today in certain parts of Judaism, there is no real belief in life after death. You don't find that in the way you do in Christianity. However, there was, shortly before the time of Christ, there was within Judaism a movement, a sub-movement, that did indeed believe there was life after death. It was not the predominant view, but it was an emerging view. If you bring that forward to today, there's still a mix within Judaism on the answer to this question. There's no part of Judaism that I'm aware of that would have as fully defined an expectation of life after death as Christianity. Now, it is interesting that Islam also bases a lot of its teaching on a life after death as well. That's something in common with Christianity. Judaism is a mixed bag on this, but you will hear from modern rabbis who would not conduct a funeral in the same way I would, right, with an expectation of what's coming next, but that your legacy lives on in the things you've done here that follow you, right? That some of you are nodding your heads like, yeah, you've heard this. Well, there's value in that too, right? I think the downside to a certain form of evangelical Christianity is it's all about when we all get to heaven, and it's not enough about what we're going to do on earth, right? Maybe there's a middle ground somewhere. Cody?
When you remember when we could go to, Wilshire could go with Temple Emmanuel and do that study about 2 years ago. Well, I understood so much after that study. It was just 4 or 5 or 10 of us, but their Sunday school lessons. No, they don't call it Sunday school, but they're on patience, kindness, loving your neighbor, helping your neighbor. I mean, there's not. I don't know all of them, but the lessons. Each week we were given a message to think about one thing, like patience,
right,
and concentrate on patience. And that's where they get that their life will be what they did before. I mean, they were patient with people, or they were not patient with people.
Right, you leave a legacy.
Yes, a legacy.
Right, and let me just also add, that's a great commercial. If you are not following Rabbi Deborah Robbins' book on Psalm 27 that we're working through in worship, there are copies available in the church office. I've found it to be really well written and beautiful. Some of the daily readings in there are really, really insightful. Caroline?
I was just curious, is all of this in the Judea, with the Jewish people, because they believe that the Messiah has not come yet?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with that.
Well, then why on earth do they think that anything to do with Revelation? I mean, you know,
Well,
these are Jewish people.
Revelation's not scripture to them.
Oh, okay, well.
Yeah,
These are
New
Jewish
Testament.
people in the past.
Right.
That John was writing this to comfort. and
Yeah, he was
support.
writing it to the early Christians, some of whom were Jewish and some of whom had not been Jewish.
Right.
Right? Okay, while we're paused, questions?
Do Messianic Jews believe in that?
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, so Messianic Jews are sort of hybrid. They're Christians who want to maintain their Jewish identity, ethnicity, and heritage, and do not talk to other Jews about Messianic Jews. Not a happy conversation, right?
Considers himself a redeemed Jew.
A redeemed Jew, yeah. Yeah.
I've heard of a completed Jew.
Yeah, same thing.
Okay.
That's, yeah, so you can understand why that would upset other Jews,
Yeah.
right? Not a
Same
good
thing
conversation to
with what you
have.
said.
Jim?
Completely.
Back in those days, they used to have, the pyramids and such like that, and they found that the royalty and such back then liked to have things in the tomb with them, so that they would, in the afterlife, would have things with them.
Oh, right, so in other
So-
cultures, yes.
But do you find that, since it was going on at the same time, Christianity was going on, or I guess not really Christianity, I
Judaism.
guess
Yeah.
Judaism, do you find any similar type
No.
belief?
No. So, for example, Jim's raising an excellent point. With an Egyptian life, ancient Egyptian life, we know that they believed in an afterlife. right? Because you see the pyramids and these very elaborate, all these things that have to do with what was going to go with them into the afterlife. And in a lot of cultures, there is an elaborate belief in an afterlife. So it's not unique to Christianity. Yes?
One of the kind of interesting after effects of this is the lack of afterlife belief by the Jews may have contributed significantly to the contribution they have made to this world, because this is it for them. There's nothing else to do except do something worthwhile, so they wind up with Nobel Prizes.
That is an excellent point, right? And so much philanthropy and so many good things have been started by the Jewish people around the world. Right, there's a lot of contribution there, and I think it's a really excellent point. Pat?
I just found out the other day that emeritus thing out at Richland College was started by the Jewish community. I did not know that.
Okay. Very good.
It also explains why they put such a emphasis on progeny and why a barren woman was such a disaster.
Well, yeah, particularly in ancient times. Of course, you also have the real issue that some of you have grown up with in an earlier time in America, where you needed a big family to keep the farm and the business and
Going on.
you needed workers.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
We needed slave labor, actually.
Children as your labor. Yeah. Not to leave this too far behind, but move on further in chapter 21, verses 22 to 27. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, as with so much of Revelation. Is this, again, if you follow my view that Revelation is an illustrative vision that is not to be read literally, this is not describing a physical place where there is no light other than the glory of God. We don't know what that means, but at least it means that the power, the energy of God fills everything that's there, right? And that why do we use earthly language to describe heaven with the nations? Nations are an earthly construct, not a heavenly construct. So why is John talking about nations walking by the light of God there? And kings, that's an earthly construct. Why is John talking about kings of earth bringing their glory into heaven? Why would John be mixing these ideas? What thoughts do you have on that?
Just a connection piece, something that we can grab on, like humans can grab onto and conceptualize.
Well, so I think that's a possibility that if you're talking about all things coming under submission of God in the heavenly realms, that's a way to say that we would hear, right?
I think it's just because he didn't have any words to describe what he saw, so he had to use the words he had.
Yeah. So I saw a really interesting thing in Detroit this week. I've been out scouting next year's senior adult trip with the adventurers, and I ended up in Detroit the last day. And there's a huge complex there that was the Henry Ford Center. Have any of y'all been there? So it's a 9-acre indoor thing. They've got presidential limos, like the limo that JFK was shot in Dallas. They have it. The presidential limo that Reagan got into after he was shot, they have it. They have this whole string of these things. And by the way, now they have Rosa Parks' bus.
Really?
Which they bought on eBay.
I love you, Mark.
Isn't that fascinating? I asked the guy, how did the Rosa Parks bus get to be in Detroit? And he said, well, it had been in a field for a long time in someone's house. And they put it up for sale eventually on eBay. And they were competing on eBay, as he told the story, against the Smithsonian and some other museum.
Oh.
Like, well, that's crazy, right? But one of the here's my point of all this. One of the things they have there is purported to be. I also ask her, how do you know that's actually the bus?
That's what I would think.
And it's the serial number.
Oh.
Yeah. One of the other things that's there is what's purported to be the first iteration of a passenger train. Did y'all see this when you were there? See, you need to go back.
Yeah, it's overwhelming, really.
So it's absolutely overwhelming, the place is. So you have an early engine of a locomotive, and behind it you have what looks a whole lot like stagecoaches on wheels that sit on track, right?
Well, that's okay.
Well, think about it. If you're innovating from one thing to the next, you often don't get the whole thing right away. You have to adapt with what you understand in the moment to be able to. I mean, they wouldn't have thought of a sleek, long car because they'd never seen anything like that before.
No.
So what do you haul people around? You haul people around in stagecoaches. So let's take a stagecoach and put it on rails. Right?
Good idea.
So the reason I'm telling you that story is sometimes we've got to have these practical things we can understand right now that get us to a greater vision down the road. And a lot of the language that John uses in Revelation is intended to speak to his early readers and hearers who could not have the vocabulary that we have today to do that. So they're putting stagecoaches on railroad tracks. Hard.
That's exactly what I was gonna say. Except you said it better.
And this is the history of innovation all the way around. There's this wonderful concept that is called the adjacent possible. And I've talked about this in the past and written about it. It's the idea that you can only envision pretty much one step ahead. So here's an example of this that's sort of an old song. Before the internet existed, you could not have envisioned YouTube. Because YouTube could not have existed without the internet. Not only that, YouTube couldn't have existed on the internet until there was high bandwidth available on the internet. So it's a multi-stage process. That thing that we call YouTube could not exist with these other things not happening first, and you got to go one step at a time to get there. That's the history of innovation. Well, let's apply that to our spiritual understanding as well and realize that John, in speaking to early Christians, could only describe to them something that he had to give them some concrete ideas that they could understand what it was. Otherwise, it would have been like saying a spaceship's coming down, right? What is that, right? Other thoughts on this?
I have to say this, that gives a whole new concept to coach class.
Coach class.
That's funny.
Thank you.
And if anyone wants to see Henry Ford's museum, it's on Channel 11 on Saturdays at 10:30.
Oh, well, okay.
Uh-huh, it
I
really
didn't know
is.
that. All right, look at Revelation 22, 1 through 5. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. We got a hymn about this. And the Lamb of God, and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face. That's really important. Remember, even Moses couldn't see the face of God. And his name will be on their foreheads. Now, is he talking about like a literal name written on your forehead? Probably not. Because we don't know what a heavenly body is like.
We don't even know we'll have a forehead.
And we don't know if you'll have a forehead, that's right. It may be all wrinkledy and space alienish, I don't know.
Great.
And night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. Now think about the time John is writing that is before electricity. Okay? So the ability to have light is immensely significant. We just walk into a room and we have light. That was not their experience at all. So for John to talk about there being always light is something they couldn't, I mean, that, again, revolutionary to them. Now, I'm not saying heaven's electrified, thanks to Thomas Edison, but it does, we have a different perspective on what that means. But what he's trying to say to them is there's a constancy to things. There is an eternal brightness to things that would be really mystical and magical to them, right? Now, here's the last thing I want to say about this, and then we'll discuss it a bit more. I think one of the dangers of modern Christianity is that we have lost a sense of mystery about the divine. And what I mean by that is we can dig down and try to explain everything in the Bible and miss the point. You can be trivia wise about the Bible and overall vision foolish, right? Just because you can play a Bible trivia game and find 7 or 10 things about each book of the Bible or know all the names or what, I mean, that's worth it. Go do that. It's great for crossword puzzles, and it's good use of your brain cells, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But if that becomes the end, then you miss the picture. And I think the more we try to explain away or rationalize the things of God, the more we lose the sense of divine awe and mystery. And one of the things that John is doing for his early Christian audience is trying to portray to them something absolutely inconceivable to them, right? Just absolutely beyond their imagination. And he uses prophetic, visionary language to do that. Whether that visionary language exactly speaks to us today in the way we want it to is not really the main point. But the fact that the message, I think, about heaven and about eternity with God is the Bible promises that there is eternal life, however you get there, or wherever it is, right, physically. There's to be a mystery about it to us. And that if we understood all things, we would be like Adam and Eve, having eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of eternal life, and we would be like God. And we know that we're not God. So every attempt to describe in detail what heaven will be, I think it's probably a futile exercise. That doesn't mean we don't need to think about it or be curious about it. It just means that if we obsess over it, we're missing the larger point, in my view. Now, thoughts, comments, corrections.
I'm wondering, you're saying what heaven will be, but then there is heaven now. So, I guess, you see what I'm saying? We're
From our
referring to
perspective,
heaven.
what heaven will be.
Okay, so we're referring to heaven, and what heaven is now and what heaven will be are two different things. Will be.
So now we're back
will
to
be
timing.
Rebuilt, will be
Right.
renewed.
Yeah, so again, this question that plagues us over and over again, how can heaven be a present reality and a future hope? And my answer is it's a matter of differences of scales of time, right? That what is now will be, world without end.
And actually, I think heaven is now because the people that have already gone before. And it's a future hope because we're not there yet.
Carol Ann, that was beautifully said. I could not have said that any better myself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Takes care of
Beautiful
all.
said. Yeah, yes.
I think there's a lot to be said for that mystery. I have nephews that are millennials and such, and they can't get their arms around this. Why do you think that there's some God up there that's dangling with people's lives? they don't, I think that part of the reason that they don't see Christianity the same way I see Christianity is because they think they know everything. Now, I'm not trying to be that way, but what I don't think that they see the mystery, and I don't think that they see that there's just some things that you're not gonna have the answers to, and you just have to be there on faith. I think that may be what my folk, or I don't know, maybe other people that think that way, but I just kind of think that may be some of the things that my folk think about, or not.
Yeah, no, it's Gene, I see you nodding your head on that as well. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I know some time ago when we were still in these kinds of lessons, you were talked about a folk singer that had a song about the mystery. And at that time, I couldn't think of what, this song that I was trying to think of, but Van Morrison had a song. He had a whole album where he was searching for something spiritual. And he has this song saying, let go into the mystery, just let yourself go. Open up your heart, you know, trust in God, He's the one. Just let go and embrace the joy and embrace the mystery, which is, you know,
Yeah.
the same kind of idea.
So
You don't know.
Mary's the one I have to thank for the Iris DeMent song, Let the Mystery Be.
Played it at my husband's funeral.
Yeah, I had never heard it before that day. And it was so captivated me that I've used that song over and over again as an illustration. Let the Mystery Be. It's a beautiful, I've called it my favorite funeral song. There you go. Yes, Pat.
All this reminds me of, because I just was watching Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ.
Yes.
Because the guy was so determined to prove atheism, but in the end he couldn't. And so then he accepted Christ by faith. And the whole thing is about the faith issue.
That's a good book
Yeah.
several years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Dusty hand, yes.
You talk about this being something that's supposed to amaze you and so forth and really capture your imagination.
Yes.
I'm reminded of the time when our now 51-year-old son was about 4 or so, observing a turtle pulling his head and feet out of his shell, and the look of amazement on his face. And I thought, you know, this kid would probably not be amazed at that anymore. He has an undergraduate degree in biology, of all things. He went to medical school, he did his postgraduate. I mean, he's gone beyond the point of being amazed. Then the question comes is, can we today, and I'm resonating with what you said there about the millennials think they know everything, you know? Well, not only the millennials, well, my son doesn't know. Well,
Yeah, he's not a millennial.
Yeah. But really, we need to have something that really captures us and astonishes us and causes us to be awed by.
So this is the reason some of the old timers told you education would ruin you. Cody?
Well, that's kind of the way we are when we come to Jesus. I mean, we accept Him, but you know, you've not touched Jesus, or you've not, you know, in Catholicism, I go back to channel, you know, there's statues and everything else that you can, and we trust, we really trust, and hope.
So it's interesting that there are two sides of faith that try to explain everything away.
Right.
There's the uber rational side of faith that tries to come up with an explanation for everything. And then there's the other fundamentalist side of faith that it seems obsessed with explaining everything away. Like, let's find every bit of archaeological evidence we can find to, we need validation for the Bible. Well, let the mystery be.
That's what I grew up in that, where every year we would have a Revelation revival, you know, and he would have the signs up, and it would be what every crown stood for and every horn stood for, and then it would be like, and that's why it's going to happen in '84, you know. It was just,
yeah,
it was great.
Okay.
Well, none of your verses included music. And as a harpist, you know,
yes,
that I was really looking forward to all those harps in heaven, and you just disillusioned me. And you said, none of it's real.
So one of the things I said in the very first lesson on this, I was quoting the theologian Peter Kreeft. And his book, Everything You Ever Want to Know About Heaven But We're Afraid to Ask. He has a chapter or in there on music in heaven. What he says is,
There's gotta be harps.
not only will there be music in heaven, but heaven is music. Yeah, what he says is that heaven is itself music, right? Isn't that a beautiful idea? And he takes that from the beginning of Genesis, right, where God speaks creation into being. And he uses the idea that that is a sung word, that God is the singer in this. Now, isn't that a beautiful idea as well? Those of you who are Chad and Maya's generation may remember a guy named Calvin Miller, who was a Baptist pastor who wrote a trilogy of books called The Singer, the Song, and the Finale. They were sort of parables, right? And the first of those was based on this very idea that God is the singer who calls things into being. And I love that. Linda?
God, and then this idea about wonder, I'm assuming that other people's faith journeys are similar to mine in that you believe, but then at some point, something happens that is so unexplainable that the only explanation is God, and then you're like, oh, and then you learn to look for it, and when you learn to look for it, then the fellow when I was coming home, when I was coming to Houston for my very first job, and it was midnight, and I was on the highway between Austin and Houston, and I had a flat tire, and I was driving a huge car which I could not even lift the spare, so how would I change it even if I knew how? And I'm sitting there on the deserted freeway thinking, okay, now what? And I made up my mind I was gonna have to get out and walk because, well, if Jack the Ripper was coming, he could get me even in the car. So I just had to do something. I got out and I started to walk, and this fella in an El Camino shows up and says, do you need a ride? Do you need some help? And I'm like, yeah. And after I got in his car and he circled back around and was changing my tire, he told me he was the local parish priest. Now, and that he saw me stopped on the road from a parishioner's house on the side of the freeway and came out to find me. Did God send him? It seems like it to me. And at that point you're like, okay, so when it says worry about nothing, but just trust the Lord and ask him for what you need, okay.
Let's end on that note. Once you learn to believe in the mystery, it's easier to see the mystery around you. Next week, we're going to continue this conversation. We're talking about angels and demons. Not the Dan Brown book, but the real thing.
And the buffet.
And we'll have the buffet with the goodies you bring to share with that. All right, as we say goodbye to our live stream folks, let's move to our prayer time. We're so glad that you've joined us in Discovery Class via live stream today, and we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us in person, we would love to meet you as well. We meet every Sunday morning, about 9:45, 9:50, in the parlor at Wilshire Baptist Church, 4316 Abrams Road here in Dallas. If you'd like to know more about Wilshire, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.